A terrible disease was draining the life out of him, leaving only an empty shell. It was not in his blood or his bones, it was in his soul, a voracious parasite that fed on applause. Leo called it the hunger. It started as a faint tremor in his hands the moment a new idea sparked in his mind, a brilliant, shimmering concept for a building that could reshape the skyline. But before his pencil could even touch the paper, the hunger would demand its tribute. It was a physical craving, a desperate need to feel the warmth of praise before a single brick was laid. His mind would race past the grueling work of blueprints and stress calculations, straight to the glorious finale, the press conference, the adoring faces, the validation that his genius was recognized. His latest vision, the Olympus Tower, was his masterpiece. A twisting spire of glass and green terraces that seemed to breathe with the city. It was the project that could silence all doubters, the one that could finally satisfy the hunger for good. He clutched the preliminary sketches, the lines almost vibrating with potential. He could start working now, lock himself away, and wrestle this beautiful monster into existence. Or he could do what he always did. He could feed the beast. The choice was a raw, physical ache. He tried to resist. For an hour, he sat at his drafting table, the silence of the office deafening. The clean white paper mocked him. The hunger gnawed at his insides, whispering that a dream untold was a dream that did not exist. It told him he was nothing without their approval. He broke. He picked up the phone and called a press conference. It was a spectacular performance. Leo painted a picture with his words, describing every curve of the tower, every sun-drenched atrium, every whisper of the wind through its sky gardens. The room was captivated. Journalists scribbled furiously, investors nodded with wide, greedy eyes. The applause that followed was a tidal wave, a euphoric drug that flooded his system and washed away all doubt. He felt powerful, invincible. That night, his chief rival, Marcus, cornered him by the bar. Marcus's buildings were technically proficient but utterly soulless, and he despised Leo's flair. A lovely fairy tale, Leo, Marcus sneered, his smile thin and sharp. But dreams do not pay the bills. The board wants to see a foundation, not a fantasy. Just then, the project's primary investor clapped Leo on the shoulder. Do not listen to him, my boy. That presentation was everything. In fact, that passion is why we re-green-lighting your preliminary funding. We need that public vision to secure the second round. The investor's words were meant as a compliment, but they landed like a death sentence. The hunger had not just been fed, it had been made a condition of his success. Chapter 2. The high from the presentation lasted exactly 12 hours. The next morning, Leo sat at his desk, staring at the same blank sheet of paper. The Olympus Tower, which had felt so real and vibrant in his speech, now seemed like a distant, impossible ghost. The applause had been the reward, and his mind, satisfied, saw no reason for the labor. The hunger was quiet, sleeping off its feast, leaving behind a cold, hollow emptiness. Days turned into a week. Every time he tried to work, his mind would replay the standing ovation. He already felt the victory. The thought of the tedious, silent struggle to actually earn it felt pointless, like a joke with a punchline he already heard. He started avoiding calls from the investors. The pressure mounted, a physical weight on his chest. His confident facade began to crack. To get a small, pathetic fix, he found himself announcing mundane tasks to his assistant. I'm going to organize these blueprints now, Sarah, he declared, just to hear her say, great idea, Leo. Each empty compliment was a sip of salt water to a man dying of thirst. He was losing control, the spiral accelerating downwards. He spent his nights walking the city, staring up at the soulless towers built by men like Marcus, and was consumed by a tidal wave of self-loathing. He was not an architect anymore, he was a storyteller, a performer whose only stage was a conference room. The project stalled completely. Finally, the inevitable email arrived. It was from the board. Mr. Vance, we require a concrete project update with foundational schematics within 48 hours. Failure to comply will result in the immediate termination of our agreement and a review of your professional conduct. 48 hours. The two words echoed in the silent office. He had nothing. The tower was still just a dream, and now, it was about to become his public nightmare. Chapter 3. In absolute desperation, Leo drove for hours to the secluded home of his old mentor, Elias Thorne, a legendary architect who had built only 5 buildings in his entire life, each one a masterpiece. Elias was a man of few words, a creature of silence and stone. Leo, trembling, confessed everything: the creative paralysis, the crushing pressure, the hunger. He called it his disease. Elias listened without expression, then stood and beckoned Leo to follow him not to his pristine studio, but to a dusty, locked shed behind his house. He unlocked the door, revealing not a gallery of triumphs, but a graveyard of failures. The room was crammed with hundreds of broken models, snapped in frustration. Blueprints were crumpled into balls, covered in angry red ink. It was the physical embodiment of 1,000 silent, agonizing battles. The world sees the 5 buildings, Elias said, his voice a low rumble. They do not see this. This is the price. The work is not the presentation at the end. The work is the war you wage in here, alone, in the dark. The truth hit Leo like a physical blow. His disease was not the need for praise, it was the terror of this room. The fear of failure, the fear of the silent, unglamorous struggle. He felt a surge of hope. He finally understood. He would be honest. He rushed back to the city, called an emergency meeting with the board, and, with his newfound clarity, confessed his creative block. He explained his realization, hoping this raw, vulnerable truth would buy him their trust and more time. He thought he was showing strength. They saw only catastrophic risk. As he spoke, he saw a flicker of triumph in the eyes of Marcus, who was also present. The moment Leo finished, Marcus stood up. "While I admire Leo's candor," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "this project is too important for an existential crisis." He unrolled a set of his own blueprints, a bland, predictable, but complete design. "This is a real building, not a feeling. It's ready to go." The board's decision was swift and brutal. The contract was terminated. The Olympus Tower was officially handed to Marcus. Leo had taken the profound truth from Elias's graveyard and twisted it into one last, desperate performance. And it had cost him everything. He was left with nothing but the silence he had always feared. Chapter 4. Leo sat in his empty office, the termination letter on his desk. He was at the bottom, the place he had spent his entire life running from. His gaze fell on his business card, Leo Vance, Visionary Architect. A title he had given himself, another performance. He thought of Elias Thorne. The old master had no title on his door, no grand declarations. He just had the work. And in that moment of total ruin, Leo finally understood the true lesson. The point was not to embrace failure publicly, it was to make the process so private that external judgment, good or bad, became irrelevant. The hunger was not a disease, it was a symptom of a life lived for an audience. The only cure was to fire the audience. With a strange sense of calm, he walked to the wall and tore down the glossy renderings of his unbuilt fantasies. He took the box of visionary business cards and dropped it into the trash. He sat down at his drafting table, took a single sheet of paper, and began to draw. Not a tower. Not a monument to his ego. He drew a chair. The lines were simple, honest. He focused on the grain of the wood, the angle of the joinery. No one would ever see it. There would be no applause. There was only the quiet scratch of pencil on paper, the simple joy of creation. It was the first real thing he had designed in years. A year later, an influential architecture journal published a cover story on the newly completed Olympus Tower. The review was scathing. It called Marcus' building a monument to mediocrity, a hollow vessel of corporate ambition, technically perfect but emotionally bankrupt. On the final page of the same journal, in a small, unheralded column, was a photograph of a stunningly beautiful, perfectly crafted wooden chair. It was praised for its quiet genius and profound simplicity. The designer was listed as anonymous. Miles away, in a small, quiet workshop filled with sawdust and the smell of cedar, Leo was hunched over a new table, sanding down a rough edge. He did not see the magazine. He did not hear the whispers of the architecture world. The shell was finally empty, not of life, but of the disease that had mimicked it. And in that perfect, productive silence, he was finally building.